Jochen, I wanted to really start off with environmental profit and loss. I think that's what most people here are very interested. Later, we'll kind of wind the clock back and look at some of your wider interests in the environment and sustainability. But I wanted to begin just by asking you, what brought you to EP&L? What triggered your interest, and really what made you want to implement it at Puma?
Well, first of all, thanks for inviting me to be here tonight. When I heard GM Jochen, I thought there's another Jochen in the room that is genetically modified. It's like, interesting. Anyway, so now I know it's me. Thanks for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here tonight. The answer to your question is, do you want the philosophical answer or the practical business answer first?
Give me more the practical side of it to begin with.
Well, the practical answer of why we decided to do an EP&L, or actually come up with the idea to do an EP&L, was because we decided to make sustainability part of our mission statement. We actually said we want to be the most desirable and sustainable sport lifestyle brand in the world. But as I'm a very conceptual guy, I thought, well, you know, how do you quantify sustainability? What could be a tool that actually tells me what my impact really is? And that's when the idea of the EP&L was born, because it gives me that transparency in monetary terms that tells me exactly where my impacts are.
Mm-hmm. So as you said, it was you're a conceptual thinker, so you had the idea. What was the next stage in terms of actually implementing it on the ground?
Getting good partners to help us to do this immense project. You know, at the time, TIBA had not come out with their first study. I was actually talking to Pawan Sukhdev, who was a speaker at my foundation. I said, Pawan, when are you coming out with your first TIB study? And he said, well, in summer. I said, I'll be a bit quicker than you are, because there was nothing that had been done, and I felt that TIB was really the first group that was trying to put a value on nature. And we've talked about it, I mean, Ray Anderson, and before Paul Auken talked a lot about natural capital. But since 1999, it had never really been put into place. So it was kind of surprising to me when I researched EP&L and said, well, somebody must have done this, that it actually hadn't been done before. You know, so it was just a question of getting it done, having the right partners, and defining what the areas were that had the most impact on our business, looking at it first from a Puma universe, meaning what is it that we as a business do to the environment throughout the entire supply chain.
Okay, so I mean, just talking now specifically about EP&L, I mean, most people would probably have a good idea, but just explain exactly what it is.
Well, the environmental profit and loss basically looks at your negative and your positive impacts of your business. And when I say our business or your business, I'm talking the entire supply chain or value chain. It's not just looking at your own operations. It's actually taking a lot further, all the way to the first tier of your supply chain. And I think that's critical, because you could say, we just heard the example, own operations waste-free or carbon neutral through your own operations. But when we talk about the results of the EP&L, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've accomplished a whole lot throughout your supply chain if you've just focused on your own operations, unless you control your entire supply chain. So it gives you values throughout the supply chain. It also defines what your impacts actually are: carbon, water, land use, pollution, waste, etc. And it puts these impact drivers into relation to each other. And again, a lot of companies say, I'm focusing on water. The next company may say, I'm focusing on carbon. The next company may say, I'm focusing on pollution. But you may come to the wrong conclusions when you just look at one impact driver rather than all the impacts that you need to take into consideration in order to really get the full picture. So you're looking at the entire supply chain, you're looking at your impacts, and then you can actually have on one page a summary that tells you where your impacts really are and how big they are in relation to each other.
And do you view this as just a guide, an estimate? I mean, looking at some of your figures, I see you put, I say you, the Puma EP&L, the figure for the impact of water is 47.4 million euros. I mean, these are very accurate figures. Can they be trusted, or is this it's just a guide and it'll help you to get where you want to go?
Well, they are not perfect, but whether it's 10% more or less wouldn't necessarily or at all change my decision making of what I need to do in order to try and get rid of those impacts. So it's all about data collection, having the right data, and then of course it comes down to which valuation do you actually apply. But once you've defined that, you can actually define your impacts pretty well. Water is more complicated because it's a local resources that has different values at different places in the world. But carbon, the cost of carbon or carbon emissions, whether they happen in India or Europe, still have the same negative effect. So it's actually much easier. It's just a question of what valuation do you apply. But I'd say even if the figures are not perfectly accurate, 10 years from now, they will be very accurate. And nowadays you can collect data very quickly. And from that perspective, it's not really a question. You just have to do an EP&L, and even if the data is not perfect now, it will still give you all the information you need in order to make educated decisions later on.
Sure. I mean, you've already touched on this. Again, I think for your company, the figures were something like almost 95% of the impact was down the supply chain. So very little is actually from Puma itself. How do you go about then engaging with your suppliers and addressing that problem?
Well, that's really, having run Puma for 18 years, it was a real eye-opener, and I never thought I would be that surprised looking at the ultimate figures. And I would say a lot of CEOs, once they've done, or anybody in business, who does an EP&L will be very surprised about the results, because most likely your impacts are not necessarily where you think they are. So for us, to give you an example, 57% of our environmental impact actually happens with the decision what raw material we use. It's rubber, it's leather, it's cotton. Those three raw materials at the production level, at the field cotton, rubber level, or where the livestock is actually growing up, is where 57% of your impact happen. So with the selection of the designer and the developer, what raw material to use, you've already created 57% of your impact. If you then add the processing of those three raw materials, you're already at around 75%. Your own operations only account for 6% of the total impact. So you may say, I'm doing everything to optimize and improve my own operations. I may say I do the same in our factories, but I'm actually only impacting not even 20% of the overall impact that we have. So the further you go away throughout your supply chain, the bigger the impact gets and the more complicated it is actually to find solutions, because it now means that an industry that has been using leather and cotton and rubber for 100 years now needs to find alternatives, and that's when it gets complicated. And you may have read the Financial Times article that said that Puma will give a boot to leather, rubber second, a boot to leather, and that created a huge stir because, of course, the leather industry wasn't too happy about that statement. But at the end of the day, it actually means that we have to find alternatives to the raw materials that we're using in a very traditional business, and that's where it gets really complicated, because those alternatives are either not there, or the materials we use are not sustainably grown, if they can even be grown sustainably.
But are you finding this difficult? Presumably because, we'll come on a little bit later in terms of just who else is getting involved in this whole concept. But Puma's a big company, but its buying power is only so strong. How much sway do you have over it? For example, you say the production of leather. You're so far removed from that.
Well, and you can't really make leather sustainable as much as you try. You can, of course, make the leather processing less unsustainable, but it's never going to be sustainable because the footprint of livestock and growing livestock is just so significant that even if you increase the size of the, how many cattle you raise on a certain acreage, may increase that, your impact still is significant. And given today's consumption level of beef, it's very unlikely that that is going to change. So you'll actually have to say, okay, leather you cannot make sustainable. You'll have to look for alternatives down the road. And that's why I'm saying it gets a bit complicated, because you really have to find alternatives to your traditional raw materials. Yes, you can make cotton organic. Yes, you can think of rubber and making it more sustainable and being less grown in monocultures. But the footprint will still be very significant. So you have to either look into recycling mechanisms, or you have to look for new materials. And that's something that's not going to happen overnight.
Sure. So you've set out on this path. you've got your figures in front of you. I mean, you've already mentioned the first thing that struck you is just how much of the impact is the supply chain. But talk us through the process of your thoughts and the actions that you first took when you had these figures, in terms of the mindset of the company and the specific actions that you've now started to take.
Well, before we did the EP&L, the mindset was, let's reduce our impact by 25% in everything we do. Until we did the EP&L, realizing that what we've defined as our universe, it was just jumping too short. And our industry doesn't necessarily know where our raw materials are coming from. We may know the country, but we do most likely not know exactly which farm or the cotton, the rubber, the leather come from. So we had to make some assumptions here. But again, the 25% reduction was on a factory level. So we said, okay, our own operations, including our manufacturing, is where we want to improve by 25% by 2015. If we accomplish that, which I think we will, including making 50% of our products more sustainable based on a definition that we came up with, it will still not take our environmental impact, 10%, or reduce our environmental impact by more than 10%, because again, the big footprint is much further away. So we'll accomplish our goals and it looks great, but the reality is our impacts are much further away in the supply chain, and for that we do not have an answer yet, because it's something which will take time. It's something where we'll have to talk to and are talking to the chemical industries, telling us, or telling them, please find us materials that can actually replace the material that everyone has been happy with for 100 years plus. In addition to closing the loop, trying to recycle, but even there it gets complicated, and we can talk about our first product-related EP&L that we launched a few weeks ago, where we also closed the loop, and it's called the InCycle collection, which is taking the cradle-to-cradle principle in mind. But even there, you will see it's a little more complicated than just closing the loop.
Yeah, I mean, this is what I wanted to move on to next. I mean, your first, certainly the initiative that there was a lot of publicity about was your shoe bags. I actually bought a pair of Pumas last year, and I was given a box. So I went today thinking I'm going to get one over on you, because obviously it failed. And I walk in the door, and I can't move for shoe bags. And the shop assistant told me that you're going full ahead with that. But I mean, how successful has that been? And then that was obviously the first, but now you're looking at recycling, returning goods from customers that can return. Talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, the shoebox was interesting because people love shoeboxes, and to get rid of it wasn't that easy. But by 2013, we will be 99% shoebox free, which basically means that packaging we will reduce packaging by 70%, which is significant. Now, the replacement of the shoebox still costs us a little bit more than our original shoebox, which is interesting. You would think that it's cheaper because it's less material, but because it needs to have a certain stability and it's different materials we are using, it's actually a little bit more expensive. But that will help, and it actually, in our InCycle collection, where we are looking at traditional products versus the InCycle products, that packaging reduction has a significant impact on the overall results. So packaging is an important tool to reduce your impacts, but it's not the most important one.
You've talked already about the fact that these initiatives cost you money. You've said that the reason behind this is sustainability and to reduce Puma's impact. You're obviously preaching to the converted here, but there's a lot of people that will say, this all sounds great, but as a company it's going to cost me money. What are the benefits? So how would you go about convincing those people? What is the business case for EP&L?
Well, I think we are kidding ourselves if we are saying that sustainability comes free of charge, and a lot of businessmen are trying to argue the sustainable case by saying, yes, you will reduce your fuel consumption and you will be more efficient, and therefore it'll save you money. And that may be the case in certain areas, for sure. But if you're really looking at your impact, and if you really want to reduce it, it's not something that comes free of charge. So if I just look at Puma as an example, if I decided today that I would switch from regular cotton to organic cotton, if I would switch from regular rubber plantations to more sustainable ones, and leather is impossible to change, it would take about 30% of my bottom line, just those two decisions. So it's not as easy if you really want to change. Of course, you can change your cars to hybrid cars, which may sound great, but it's not really moving the dial. So if you are really trying to reduce your true impacts, not just the ones that are looking at your own operations, not just the ones that may save you money, it will be an investment which cannot be justified in the short term. So I'd say, we have to call a spade and move away from just kidding ourselves and saying it comes free of charge. It is a long-term investment, but at the end of the day, if you want to reduce your risks that are around the corner, that I'm sure will happen if you're not becoming more sustainable. So from a risk management point of view, it's something every business has to look at. If you believe in more sustainable, longer-term shareholder value, it's an investment you make just like you're investing into marketing or into R&D. So it's got to be part of your business case. And if you're a responsible businessman, there's no question that you have to do it. So either way, the answer always has to be yes, even though it's not as easy as you think it is.
So you're saying this isn't just a moral question. There is a business case. It's just the long term. There's no short-term gain here. Case.
I'd say for traditional businesses, but if you take the EP&L as an example, I believe that if everyone did an EP&L today, we would have a lot more solutions much quicker, because there will be new businesses that will focus on helping to find new solutions to reduce your impacts. I mean, the amount of companies that have come to us and says, we have found the material for you that will reduce your environmental impact by X, has been amazing. So businesses are being created to help you to reduce your impact. So if we start internalizing those externalities and make them transparent and visible, that's when business will kick into gear and actually find solutions. So for the traditional businesses that have to change their model the most, it's an investment, and for others it's a short-term investment, because once you have the solution you can actually make a lot of money with it too. So look at it, traditional business versus new businesses that will help you to reduce your impact, and that's where I think a lot of money can be made.
But I mean, as you say, what we're talking about here, they are externalities. When are they going to become internalized to the company, and what's going to drive that process?
Well, I would say hopefully soon, and we will, the initiative that Richard Branson and I are starting early next year, and we've already talked about a few weeks ago, will try to look at taking the EP&L to the next level. So one day, I believe it should be, every business should do an EP&L, or whatever it may be called 10 years from now. Every business should be transparent, at least on a voluntary basis, about where impacts really are. And I truly believe if we want to change traditional businesses, at some point it also needs to become a mandatory requirement for businesses, and whether it's through integrated reporting as a starting point, or governments that are taking the lead, that are saying, you should be transparent about your impact. I think those are the things that need to happen.
When will they happen? I mean, this is the question, isn't it? Because this is what we'll come on to in terms of the way the economy is set up. But a lot of businesses, they don't look long term. Surely this has to come from above. And whether it's your work, again, we'll talk about the B team later. But I mean, just how involved are governments, and what kind of feedback are you getting? Presumably you're lobbying for this.
Well, having been at Rio +20, a lot of governments are saying we actually need business to help us fix the problem. And, there's a lot of businesses out there that are putting their money to make sure that those laws are not being passed. So it's, positive. I always talk about positive lobbying. Let's try and make sure that those laws get passed that are actually helpful for our environment, rather than preventing the laws that, or putting money into something that is preventing that to happen. And that's what we will try and do with our B team and our initiative, to make sure that those businesses that are really progressive and innovative and believe that, business is a force for good, or at least can be a force for better, are taking the initiative to scale something like the EP&L, in order to tell governments, what, take this as an example and try and change your legislation around it. And let's take businesses first. Let's not wait for governments. Let's take the responsibility as a responsible businessman, and let's be, you know, in the forefront and really lead the change rather than waiting for others to put a legislation upon us. I think that's our responsibility as businesses, and I don't think it's that scary. I mean, I remember when I decided to launch the EPNL, everyone said that's going to be a PR nightmare, because you're actually admitting about your environmental impact. And I said, well, everybody knows business is not having a positive impact, so I'm not really telling anybody anything new. And the result was actually very positive. You know, it was perceived globally as a truly, you know, gutsy move, for sure, but also something that was, you know, the right way forward. So I can only encourage businesses to be transparent about their impacts, because everyone knows, you know, our impact isn't that great. And anybody's footprint, yours, mine, isn't positive on this planet.
I mean, there's no question that Puma's gone out on a limb, and you say you've had positive feedback, but do you see action from other companies?
Silently, I think there are a lot of companies that are looking at their environmental footprint and at the EPNL. So I know that there are some that are doing EPNLs, but they don't want to necessarily commit to it yet until they have the results. But that's an initiative that the B team will be taking up, and you know, one of our challenges will be to scale the EPNL to a level where it becomes very visible. And Puma is not the only showcase, but other brands will. In fact, our holding company PPR has committed all of its 21 brands to do an EPNL by 2016. And I'm sure in the next 12 to 24 months, we'll have a significant amount of companies in different sectors and industries who will commit to the EPNL. So hopefully a year from now, I'll be able to report something positive.
Let's hope so. I just wanted to widen it out. I mean, you've touched on the work of the B team, which I'd like to ask you specifically about. But just before we get to that, I mean, you've talked about companies being a little slow, silently looking at their environmental costs. I mean, I've talked about companies looking at short-term profit, but surely the system we're in, capitalism and publicly listed companies, their motivation is short-term profit. And isn't there just a fundamental contradiction there, that it's just not in the interests of publicly listed companies to spend money and to rework their business models towards sustainability and EPNL?
Not enough companies are looking at it long term, but I mean, I think we have good examples with Unilever, which was mentioned earlier. You know, Paul Polman is trying to base the business model of Unilever on sustainability, and you know, he's saying it's non-negotiable, and it's the only way in order to, you know, to be sustainable also from a financial point of view in the long run. So. You know, absolutely more businesses need to step forward, and I don't think it's something where businesses necessarily need to compete. I think we will need to collaborate in order to find joint solutions, and then we can compete who's the fastest in sustainability, but not necessarily when it comes to trying to find solutions. It comes down to investors and shareholders, institutional investors, private investors. They need to change their horizon. It's also a challenge, short-term versus long-term investing, that we will be taking on as a B team. If you look, you know, 20 years ago, the average shareholding was, I believe, 6 years, and it's come down to 3 months. So that's not sustainable if you really try to make your business long-term sustainable, not just from a financial point of view. There are not enough businesses. It needs to change. There are a lot of things happening, you know, but when we will hit the tipping point, I think we're probably still a few years out.
I mean, we've talked a little bit about government. What role is the consumer have in all of this? I mean, presumably the consumer is vitally important. And do you feel that there's enough momentum from consumers to push for this change?
Well, I think we see where business is failing badly, the consumer has a very loud voice already. So I would say the consumer has tremendous power. He and she are not really quite using that power yet. But businesses often say, well, the consumer's not ready, you know, and they're not willing to pay more. And I'm always saying, well, you know, who invented consumerism? Was the consumer or the company that told the consumer it's time to buy an iPad or something else, you know? So I think we have a responsibility as a business to also, just like we need to educate ourselves, to educate the consumer for a more sustainable lifestyle and to come out with really sexy products that are sustainable. You cannot expect a consumer to say, it's sustainable and therefore you should buy it. Just like you can't sell a consumer car if it's ugly looking and it's a hybrid. You know, the car still needs to look good. So I think it's our responsibility to come up with really cool products that the consumer is excited about, and it is also sustainable, and then maybe we can charge a little bit more. In the long run, I don't think the product needs to cost more. Certainly not when you start incorporating also externalities and starting to make them visible, which we are trying to do with our first product EP&L, because it's for the first time putting products into relationship to each other and telling the consumer that this product is more sustainable than another product, which has never been done before. And I think that's really unique. You know, there's so much information about green products, eco products, that, and what does the consumer really, how can the consumer really judge? So again, just like the corporate EP&L, we have to come up with a methodology that in simple words explains to the consumer why something is more sustainable or less unsustainable than another product. And if we can accomplish that, then again, we will have found a great solution. I think the food industry has done it. 15 years ago, nobody looked at calories on a cereal box. Now everyone looks at calories and the ingredients, and you're using X calories when you eat that product. If we can accomplish something similar with the product and call them, working title, environmental calories, and you're saying if you buy this product, you're using 200 environmental calories versus that product, only 100, which one would you take? Well, you take the one that uses less environmental calories. But for that, we need to standardize the EP&L, and we will need to get other businesses to say, okay, we are willing to agree on one standardization. Again, calories is something that didn't happen overnight, but by 2020, maybe we can accomplish something like that.
But I mean, do you think the responsibility of business ends there? I mean, it's almost a labeling issue. In terms of educating the audience, so in your own example, you can tell them how sustainable it is, but ultimately they're just going to choose the cheap one, aren't they?
Not necessarily. I think we need to redefine how quality is defined. I don't think a product is any longer a quality product if it's not sustainable. But that's part of an educational process that doesn't happen overnight. If you're in the luxury business, and we have a lot of luxury brands in our portfolio, we're saying, luxury is about craftsmanship, it's about tradition, heritage, but it's also about sustainability. Would we ever call a luxury product eco? No. But if we're calling it a high quality, top quality product, which means that the consumer can expect that it is sustainable. So one day we will probably stop using the word sustainability, which is a bit loaded anyway today, and we will just say, a good quality product has to be sustainable, and a cheap product isn't sustainable. So, price will be related to quality and a good quality product in the beginning, but it doesn't mean that prices cannot come down over time. So consumer education is critical, but again, it comes down to the green apple. One day there will be a company like Apple, but in the field of sustainability that says, I have the best product in the world that everybody wants, and it is sustainable. That innovation will play, and technology will play a very important role into making sustainability mainstream, that I'm sure of. So it's a combination of standardization, business being transparent, government setting rules, and then innovation to help us find solutions.
There's obviously a lot of work to be done in terms of changing the mindset of business and consumers, which presumably you've touched on this, but I wondered if you could just tell us a little bit more about this work you're doing with Richard Branson. You call it the B team. I'm not quite sure why. Everyone knows B is not as good as the A team. But
we are very humble guys, so that's why we said it shouldn't be the A team, and A team is already taken, and nobody looks like the guys in the A team anyway. So. And B team is actually, B stands for business, so it does have a deeper sense than just being the B team. It also stands for breakthrough or barrier busting or anything that basically tells you we are trying to move the needle and spearhead initiatives that others are either don't dare to take on or don't want to take on. And that's what the B team will do. We will define certain grand challenges. First of all, it's a group of business leaders and entrepreneurs that have done something right in their life other than just being good businessmen, that have a passion for changing the way capitalism and business works today and trying to make it more holistic and inclusive by taking the environment and society more into the equation. So all of the leaders that we are selecting will have contributed something to that equation in their past, in their business life. And then we will define so-called grand challenges. And we are in the process of talking to young leaders and other businessmen. And if you have any ideas of what grand challenge we should take on, please let me know. And by January, we will have those grand challenges defined. Each business leader will then take on a particular grand challenge, and then we'll run with it and hopefully we'll try and hopefully can contribute to finding some solutions. Certainly creating awareness, but it's not just a talking group. It's a group that also has an impact and hopefully can find some solutions as well.
In your own mind, you talk about grand challenges. Obviously, I guess you haven't come up with a blueprint yet, but in your own mind, what kind of challenges? I mean, are you talking about changing the face of capitalism, or are you talking about let's try and get EP&L run out again across the board?
We're trying to be more practical than saying we'll change the world and make capitalism sustainable. That's maybe a tall order. But EP&L, as you can imagine, I'm very passionate about, will probably play a role as one of the grand challenges. And scaling it and standardizing it is something that, from my point of view, makes sense. And so you can expect that to be one of the challenges.
We've only got a few minutes left. I just wanted to turn a little bit more towards you personally. I mean, I asked you at the beginning what triggered your interest in EP&L, but I was wondering if you could just tell us more about your passion for the environment and sustainability. What triggered that? I mean, just looking at your professional career, I mean, you were obviously the boss of Puma for a long time before you started really pushing these initiatives. Just talk about what drives you in this world.
Well, I mean, I sort of grew up and was educated in a very traditional way, thinking that business had a certain role to play, which was very much about making money and creating jobs, and government would set the rules, and the civil society would, raise the finger if something was wrong, and religion would provide us with the ethics and spirituality, and that was a pretty old-fashioned way of thinking, I guess. And I realized that some of the challenges that we had are facing on our planet are not getting solved. And I then realized that my influence was actually a little bigger than my own business that I was responsible for, and that we could use business to really impact change, positive change, and not leave it to others to solve the biggest problems and challenges that we have. And once you realize and are aware, as Jean-Paul Sartre once said, you're also responsible. Whether you do something about it or not, you're still responsible. So I take responsibility very seriously, and as I realized that the big problems of this planet weren't getting solved, I said, well, I'm also partially responsible for it, so I have to change the way business is being done. And that was a process that took some time. I grew up, loving nature, spending a lot of time in nature, but you sort of enjoyed nature as all of us do, and then you go back to business, you don't really think about it. So I try to create a bridge, and the EP&L is really a bridge where it takes my passion and love for nature, but it also values it in something that a businessman can understand, meaning in monetary terms, and it breaks it down to something that I can work with as a businessman. So trying to create tools that we could use in business was just something that I felt was part of my responsibility. But it was also, while I was writing a book with a Benedictine monk, that I actually spent some time in a monastery, which also gave me a bit more of a holistic view as well of the world.
You talked about the big problems of the world. I mean, what do you see as the big problems?
Boy, there are so many. Well, I mean, of course, environmental degradation is massive, and we just do not realize it because we can't touch it in many parts of the world. We can when you are there, but the loss of biodiversity and the negative effects that we have on this planet, are just shockingly bad. So I would say that's one of our biggest challenges we have, in addition to a growing population that will, by 2050, probably hit 10 billion people. So trying to balance population growth with not destroying our planet those are the two biggest challenges, you know, and bringing justice to the people that do not have the ability and possibility to live, you know, a sustainable lifestyle, while at the same time, you know, providing food for everyone else, and a lifestyle that we've acquired over the decades, which is probably unsustainable from today's perspective. So bringing that back into balance is a huge challenge. We all can try our best, and I guess the answer we'll know when we pass the next century.
Would you call yourself an optimist? I mean, looking at some of these issues, it's pretty easy to get quite depressed.
Yeah, I keep it with Bill Clinton. He said I wouldn't get up in the morning if I was a pessimist. So I'd say, you know, I look at it, the glass half empty with one eye and half full with the other, still trying to stay above water.
But I mean, do you get frustrated with the slow pace of change?
Well, I mean, change is happening very fast. The question is it fast enough? I don't think anybody has the answer, and you know, if you look back at the Brundtland report and you know, decades ago, how serious those problems have been portrayed at the time, you know, and then here we are decades later, and we really haven't improved anything. We may have found a few solutions, but certainly not enough to stop a negative trend. You know, it's scary, but as I said, I'm probably more of an optimist, and I believe at the end of the day, humankind has always found solutions when it got really nasty and difficult. So I believe that eventually we will find solutions. Yes.
The problem is too many people use that as an excuse for inactivity, I think.
Well,
the problems will be solved.
Well, you don't want to wait until that. You want to contribute, and I think that's what we're all here to do. You know, trying to contribute to positive change. And you know, the collective mind doesn't change overnight, and you know, cultural shifts happen not in years but in decades. And we just have to look at the sustainability movement as a cultural shift and a cultural consciousness, a collective consciousness that is happening over time. And once it hits the tipping point, it goes very quick. But sometimes it takes decades for something to change, and sometimes decades changes in days. So we've seen that, I think, recently, and I'm sure we'll see that again in the future. And we can all contribute to that tipping point.
Just finally, the last couple of questions before I'm going to fire some very quick fire questions at you. I just wanted to ask about sort of being a leader and setting an example, whether that's something that you're even comfortable with. But I mean, in my own life, I find that as soon as someone discovers you're interested in the environment, they immediately think they're going to judge, or you're going to judge them, and they get slightly defensive, and they try and pick holes in your behavior. But I mean, just looking at your career, you're on the board of directors of Harley-Davidson. Yeah, I understand you have a pilot's license. You're chairman of a company that puts a load of money into Formula One. I mean, some people could be forgiven for thinking you're a bit of a petrol head. I mean, there is a slight, or some people would say there's a slight contradiction there. How do you explain that?
Well, I started the sustainability committee at Harley because I actually said I have to resign from the board if you're not starting to become sustainable. So I'm contributing to positive change, I would say. I'm flying very small planes, two-seaters now, so they're not that bad. I'm offsetting my carbon footprint. My overall footprint through my farm in Kenya is, and we haven't done the EP&L on my farm yet, but I would say my net impact is positive if I look at the land that I'm looking after and keeping biodiversity intact. So once we've done our EP&L, I think my personal footprint will be judgingly at least neutral, if not positive. So with all those sins of flying a plane and flying around the world to make it better, I would say it's still a net positive, I hope at least. I'll tell you next year as well.
Okay. Last question. I mean, just for the audience here, if you could give one piece of advice for someone who's really trying to push sustainability in their company and perhaps finding it particularly difficult, finding a lot of obstacles, if you could just give them one piece of advice, what would it be?
Make sure you have a CEO who's totally committed.
Okay. We have only a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to fire some questions at you. Some of them might tell us something about you, some of them may not. Obama or Romney?
Obama.
Nuclear power, good or bad?
Bad.
BBC or social media?
Both.
I'll let you have that one. The next one you have to answer, one or the other. Nike or Adidas?
Adidas.
The euro,
It's
in
a
or
brother,
out?
you know, I mean, it's a brother. So you have to say.
The euro, in or out?
In.
Kingston or Cape Town?
Cape Town. I like Kingston too, but you know, I like Cape Town. I love Cape Town.
Space exploration, good or bad?
Good.
The Sex Pistols or Coldplay?
Coldplay, definitely.
Which do you consider the biggest threat, climate change or resource depletion?
Both.
And the final one, Darwin or God?
Well, definitely God.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.